Let us pray. Let the words of my mouth, the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These he brought to the land of Shinar and placed the vessels in the treasury of his gods. Thus the world of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, the world that they had grown up in, ended. Rounded up with the best, the brightest, the most successful, the wealthiest, the most powerful people in their city and in their country, these 4 young men, possibly as young as 13, because you became a man in their culture at the age of 12 or 13. These young men were force-marched with all their people 800 kilometres east to the city of Babylon. Only the uneducated, the lowly and impoverished were left behind in their country, those least likely to resist, so that the land might not revert to total wilderness. There in Babylon, the Fantastic Four were assessed for service in the empire. They passed the medical, the physical, and intelligence tests with flying colours. And their good looks meant that they would make the emperor look good for his PR machine as he continued to dominate the world. So for these 4, it was off to uni for 3 years of re-education. Now, it wasn't enough that they were taken from their homes, ripped from their lives, and forced to study at this university so that they could work for an evil empire, but they also had the indignity of being stripped of their identities. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah became Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Even with being stripped of their identities, they managed to choke that down as well, but they drew the line at food. You might think that's an odd thing, a trivial thing. But remember that these are most likely very young men. It's not like they have the physical powers or prowess to take up arms, to start a rebellion, the 4 of them, surrounded in the palace against the might of the Babylonian army. And it's not going to be easy for them to flee next to 1,000 kilometres away back to their homeland. And what would they find there when they arrived? Country razed to the ground. So if you're in their position, what are you going to say? What are you going to do? Are you going to say, well, I don't identify as a Babylonian. I'm going to assert my rights? No, but they could control what they put into their mouths. They were going to stay true to their dietary laws that God laid out through the prophet Moses as best they could, because they couldn't guarantee that the royal meat wasn't pig or anything else for that matter. For a Jewish person, food is at the heart of your identity. And when they strip everything else away, that's one of the very few things you've got left. Unclean food is one of those lines that just cannot be crossed. However, there's more going on here for these young men as well. Their country had been utterly laid waste by Nebuchadnezzar's scorched earth policy. And the people brutalised. The writer of Psalm 137 captures the despair and outrage and horror of the survivors in Babylon as they are goaded and sneered at by the man on the street in Babylon. Where's your God now? Sing us one of the songs you used to celebrate him. Come on, let's hear it. Pick up your guitar. The Jewish survivors, instead, they cry out to God for justice. They cry out to God for revenge, because it's their babies that had their brains smeared on the walls of the city they loved as their skulls were caved in by the enemy soldiers. The horror of that image was seared into their minds forever. To eat the royal rations of food and wine would be to eat the bread of injustice and drink the cup of abomination. And don't forget the hospitality laws of the ancient world. If you break bread with someone, if you share at their table, you are at peace with them. You are at one with them. Dan resolved not to eat the food of the man who killed his king, who killed his country, who killed the kids, who robbed his nation's most holy site and made it a joke on the streets of Babylon. The offer of royal food is also a very subtle attempt to control these men through life's basic necessities. Once you start eating their food, what's next? Going to start singing their songs, celebrating their gods? No way in hell Daniel was going to defile himself like that. The stand Daniel took that day was a dangerous one that those who have read this book so often too easily skip over. He knew full well what kind of a psychopathic, capricious tyrant ran Babylon. He knew that Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful man on earth. But Dan trusted in someone far greater. He held fast to his faith in the God of Israel, the God of the Exodus, the God who had promised them a hope and future. Because of his resolve, God allowed Dan to receive grace and favour through a bloke named Ashpenaz. Ash probably wasn't a Babylonian, but a bloke in a similar situation to them. Someone taken from another land and forced into service. He had no real reason to help Dan out or his mates because his own life, as we hear, would be very much on the line. But Ash listened to Dan's reasoning and took a chance. We have this saying even down to this day, don't we? This food is fit for a king. We say that because historically it's supposed to mean that the best diet for human health and happiness and to make one fat is the one eaten by royalty. Dan and his mates defied the odds by God's grace and got fat and healthy on vegetarian survival rations and water. Oh, God help them. What a terrible fate. So there's a miracle right there, folks. Forget the roast lamb that they grew up with mum eating. They would have been lentil as anything by the time that they were done. Strength, health, vitality, and intelligence comes not from the diets of despots, but from the grace of God. You might well ask, well, why was God gracious to these four but not to the babies of Jerusalem? God had judged Israel because as their economy and prosperity grew, so did their neglect and their contempt for the poor, the orphan, the widow, and the foreign worker. God rejected them because although they were set apart to teach the world the truth about everything, they had become fascinated with the lies of other religions. But when God executes judgment, he always draws a line, and Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon, and Edom will be held accountable for the manner in which they dealt with the people in their war and conquest. It might be allowable in God's providence to take over another country, but it is not allowable to do what they did to the children. This book of Daniel is all about God holding the powerful and the evil of the earth to account. This small act of resistance by seemingly powerless 13-year-old blokes may seem insignificant to you, but by the end of the chapter, it had already seen the Fantastic Four find favour with the most powerful man on earth. And Nebuchadnezzar couldn't see God coming through them. Look out, because in all this, God is playing the long game. We also learn at the end of this chapter that Dan served until the first year of King Cyrus. 60 years later, Dan spent his entire adult life trapped within the machinery of an evil empire with no possibility of escape, very few choices in his life at all, but he served all those decades as an agent of God's grace, playing the long game for his glory. And in the end, he lived to see his people win and take their homeland back. If only you or I had that kind of patience and were willing to play the long game in a society where we want everything to happen now. One commentator, Smith Christopher, reckons that, and I quote him at length here, the Christian life, like Daniel's, is a call to active non-conformity with the world, even in the manner in which we live our daily lives, even through the food we choose to consume and the clothing we choose to wear. The Christian life is a life of resistance to the enticements of power and control over others. What is the food and wine that modern emperors keep offering us? The key here is that these enticements can be disguised as necessities, like food. So much of contemporary advertising and marketing is directed toward changing people's habits to entice them to buy products that will become necessities that they simply can't live without. What must we draw the line on for the sake of the gospel message? Now, old mate wrote these words 30 years ago, before smartphones became a necessity in our lives, before data tracking and cookies and AI being used to get at you directly through your devices to sell you what they reckon are life's necessities ever more effectively. What must we draw the line on for the sake of the gospel message? A few hundred years ago, the slave trade was very much a part of life in England, and they enjoyed this wonderful new product that made everyone feel awesome, called sugar, that was grown, harvested and processed by slaves in the Caribbean. Now, everyone gives William Wilberforce and the evangelical Christians great credit, and rightly so, for championing the end of the slave trade. But you know what actually helped him achieve that goal more than anything was that the evangelical Christian women of London ran a campaign so successfully to convince women to stop taking sugar in their afternoon and morning tea, and forgoing 1 teaspoon of sugar in your cup of tea brought those slave traders financially to their knees, so that then the legislative and public advocacy that William Wilberforce had been doing finally got traction and won the day. A small, seemingly simple and insignificant act of defiance helped to end a horrific practice in English society and free people in another part of the world in the end. So you might think the things that you do are insignificant. But for me, I won't buy a lemon grown in the USA when we've got citrus growers here and trees easily available in our own neighbourhoods. I won't buy butter made in New Zealand to cut the throats of our own dairy farmers. I will try, wherever possible, never to buy anything made in China, because most of those people are held in virtual slavery. As a church leader, you'll never see me wear a suit, at least not in my public role, because a suit is a symbol of those who seek to oppress us and to dominate our lives. Seemingly insignificant things, will they have an effect? I don't know, but I choose to do those things because I can. Because that is one place I can make a choice. And let's never forget, the years 2020, 2021 and 2022, when we were sold vaccinations as a necessity for not only our health but the health of those around us. And now in hindsight, the efficacy of those vaccines we can see, even though if we can credit some help to them, the great claims that were made to us were definitely overblown. What must we draw the line on for the sake of our gospel message? That question will keep coming at us relentlessly as we press further into the 21st century. There is no avoiding it for any of us unless we just want to lazily collude with the evil empire around us. Even on our worst days, we'd be pushing to catch up with Dan and the three amigos and the nightmare world that they woke up into in Babylon. However, some of us have been and perhaps still are stuck in jobs where we think, why me, God? Why am I in this job? Why me, God? Why am I in this situation in life? This just sucks and I can't see a way out. I am trapped. I want you to stop and think. Maybe you are in that situation because of the providence of God. Maybe you are there as his Dan, as his Han, Mick or Azza, the Fantastic Four of Babylon. Maybe you are there in that mix because through you, God has an opportunity to go to work through his grace and mercy. Never forget, you are his child. His grace and favor are upon you. God will give you what you need to make a difference in this life, no matter where you find yourself, no matter how stuck you feel. Who knows what good he will bring through you for the benefit of others. Dan had very little control over his life for his entire 60 years that he was entrapped in Babylon. But what he could control, he made choices to honor God. We may feel that we have few choices in this life, but the choices we do have really matter. Will we make them in order to honor God? The Lord be with you.